Hey everyone, welcome back to the Lavasco Briefing. Today we bring you our Q3 legislative update. Everything retirement plan sponsors and fiduciaries need to know as we head into Q4. We'll start with one of the most talked about pieces of Secure Act 2.0, the new Roth Catch-Up Rule. Final guidance was released in September, and with the effective date of January 1st, 2026, there's a lot plan sponsors should be doing now to prepare. Then we'll pivot to an interesting move from the Department of Labor. They've pulled back some of the earlier language that discouraged private investments in 401k plans. It's a subtle shift, but it could open the door for more access to private equity inside of target date funds down the road. And finally, we wrap up with the latest litigation trends, specifically the surge in lawsuits of how plans are handling forfeitures. Courts have been mixed in their rulings, so we'll talk through what's driving these cases and what plan sponsors should do to stay protected. As always, our goal is to help you stay ahead of what's changing and what it means for your plan, your people, and your fiduciaries. So let's jump in. We'll start with the new Roth Catch-Up Rule. It's one of the more talked about Secure 2.0 provisions, and plan sponsors are already asking what it really means for them heading into 2026. Jim, tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, we've been talking about the required Roth catch-up contributions for some time now, but there have been some updates. On September 15th, final regulations were issued regarding Secure Act 2.0's Roth required catch-up provision. One of the key items for the Roth required catch-up contribution was the fact that final regulations need to be effective on January 1st, 2027. However, you have an obligation to comply effective January 1st, 2026. So what does this really mean? What this means is you have to have the steps and processes in place to make this effective on 1/1 of 2026. However, there is going to be a bit of a grace period until 1/1 of 2027. And during that time, things are going to be a bit more stringent. And so, from our perspective, we're recommending clients continue to operate as if there is no grace period, that this is taking full effect on 1/1 of 2026. And so, a few things that plan sponsors need to think about and inventory ahead of that date. First, do you currently offer the catch-up provision in your plan? Most plans do, and so if the answer is yes, the next question you need to ask yourself is, do you allow for Roth contribution? And if the answer is no, then we'd recommend that you add the Roth contribution feature so that your individuals who are HCs over age 50 can continue contributing to the plan. If you don't add the Roth catch-up or the Roth contribution feature, these individuals will not be able to make catch-up contributions to the plan moving forward. So making sure you have that in your plan is really important. The second item is coordinating with your service provider. So the key service provider to have conversations with is going to be your payroll provider. Having conversations with your payroll provider to understand what types of automations and rules they have built into their system to be able to identify, number one, who's over age 50, number two, who is over the highly compensated employee threshold from a compensation limit. In this year, that is $145,000. And then finally, being able to automatically switch their contributions to Roth when they've exceeded the contribution limit of $23,500. So, trying to manually catch those items as they happen can be cumbersome and can potentially lead to errors from a plan administration perspective. And so making sure that your payroll provider has the proper automations or triggers in place and notify you when these things take place is really important. So again, making sure your plan is set up with Roth, with catch-up prior to 1/1 of 2026, and then making sure that you understand how your payroll provider is going to operate before 1/1 of 2026 when this plan rolls about. would be my recommended key takeaways for Roth required catch-up contributions.
All right, let's pivot to another headline that we've been tracking. This one is from the Department of Labor. The DOL has made a pretty interesting move this quarter, stepping back from earlier language that discouraged private investments in 401k plans. It's subtle, but it could open the door to some changes on how plans are built. Chris, for those that haven't followed this very closely, what exactly did the DOL change and why does it matter?
Yes, Mike, this was interesting, very similar to what we saw in the second quarter of 2025, where Trump's Department of Labor rescinded some Biden era rules as it relates to fiduciary oversight of plans. Of course, in the second quarter, we saw pulling back on ESG oversight. So that was obviously different than cryptocurrency, the same thing. So those were the two components of the second quarter. And then we saw here in August, the Department of Labor rescind the Biden era position on private investment, alternative investments. We see a lot of this as it relates to the news cycle, a lot of interest in private equity investment. But really, this doesn't mean it's a carte blanche. We're going to see 401k plans start to add a tremendous amount of alternative in private investment. It just means that they're pushing it back to fiduciaries of the plans to at least have the option, continuing with obviously the duty of prudence and the duty of loyalty, that it's the absolute responsibility of plan fiduciaries to do what's in the best interest of plan participants overall. Private investment has very unique concerns as it relates to public markets, where we would typically see mutual funds, a tremendous amount of data available, much easier to analyze and surround rationale around why you're going to add or maintain a particular investment available to 401k participants. Private investments is not necessarily the case. There is valuation issues, there's liquidity issues, certainly transparency on the fee side. So if there's consideration to add private investment to a 401k platform, it would take a tremendous amount of due diligence to actually oversee that and execute it in a way that would be prudent as it relates to 401k participants. So that may be the case for certainly the larger 401k plans. As we see kind of the small and mid-sized 401k market, it's not something we're probably going to see initially, although the door is open to consider that. Where we will probably see it is in the allocation to target date vintages. We'll probably start to add some private equity investments as part of the rules does allow professional management introduction to private investment, but this will certainly hinge on their position on QDIA rules. So most target date funds are going to be the qualified default investment alternative for the 401k. If a participant doesn't make an affirmative election on the investment side, they're automatically placed into the QDIA, and plan sponsors have safe harbor relief under those rules. However, if private equity or alternative investments are allowed in target date funds, then they have to be in line with QDIA rules. So it's just something we're going to have to see. I think it'll be a slow moving option for 401k plans over the long term. As it relates to clients or plan sponsors and fiduciaries of 401k plans, every decision that you make has to be in the best interest of participants. And when you start to look at private investment, it will probably fall outside of a current investment policy statement that provides the decision-making framework on the investment side of the 401k plan. If we start to see products become more conducive to what 401k participants need, meaning valuation, liquidity, in a way that can be analyzed from a fiduciary standard, certainly we could look at amending investment policy statements to account for that. Just understand that it will take significantly more due diligence. So we're going to continue to monitor what's going on with these markets and introduce them to clients as we feel that they're appropriate. But it was an interesting legislative update as it relates to the Department of Labor.
Maybe one thing just to highlight here. This is something that I was really excited to see from the Department of Labor. I think for a really long time, private investments and alternative investments have been something that higher net worth individuals have only been able to access through investing. And the reality is that um, majority of individuals who are saving for retirement and investing do so within 401k plans or corporate sponsored retirement programs. And so if we can find a way to get over some of the liquidity and valuation concerns that Chris had noted, and insert these into target date funds or 401k plans, I think that would be a really great thing to bring private investments and alternative investments to the everyday investor saving for retirement for a couple of reasons. Probably the most notable is the fact that typically private equity alternative investments are very uncorrelated to the stock and the bond market. And so when we highlight, the diversification of building portfolios, having something like that as a sleeve of your portfolio to give you kind of the extreme, uncorrelated exposure would just be great. And two, historically, the some of the performance, obviously doing the due diligence and research to understand and vet these options is important. But historically, they've really offered themselves as really attractive investment vehicles. So this is something I'm really excited to see how things play out for.
Yeah, definitely interesting developments there for sure. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate that feedback. Now, switching gears a bit, there's been a lot happening on the litigation front. We've been hearing quite a bit about the surge in lawsuits around 401k plans, how they handle forfeitures. And it sounds like the courts haven't been entirely consistent in their rulings. Chris, what's really driving these lawsuits, and what are the plaintiffs claiming plan sponsors are trying to do wrong?
Yeah, we've certainly covered individual forfeiture class action suits in previous quarterly legislative updates. It's really the biggest litigation component as it relates to plan fiduciaries. Really, what's driving it is the law firms that are organizing class action suits because they've seen an opening where they can attack these very large 401k plans. In almost all of these cases are going to be plan assets of billions of dollars. So they're targeting very large corporations. And just to revisit, what is being highlighted is the claim that forfeitures should not be used to reduce employers' future contributions. So standard practice has always been if you have a forfeiture account, you have the ability to do typically three things. You can reduce your future employer contributions because this is essentially the plan sponsor's asset if it's being forfeited by a participant. You can reduce plan expenses, or you can distribute across the board in a uniform way to all plan participants. So that's generally the course of action you're going to have with forfeitures. Most plan sponsors will offset their future contribution. But really what we're seeing is that litigation attacking that practice. But that has been historically what has been permitted, and certainly reaffirmed by the Department of Labor and IRS, that using forfeitures to offset employer contributions is certainly permissible and expected so long as the plan document permits it. But we are seeing case volumes increase. So we started to see these forfeiture cases trickle in. As of the end of the quarter, we have 60 outstanding cases at this point, class action suits against employers that are using forfeitures for that reason. And really what we're seeing from the courts is mixed outcomes. A lot of courts have just simply dismissed the cases outright, claiming that these class actions are just trying to create an entirely new benefit under the plan that's not really plausible for what we've seen historically. But we are seeing some district courts really allowing the cases to move forward and just seeing the way that that litigation is going to play out. And of course, when we're dealing with these very large 401k plans, we are starting to see some cases settled completely out of court. We saw one in the third quarter where Capital One just settled out of court. Even though I'm sure they could extend the litigation and defend it over time based on their practice, just as a matter of expediency, wanted to see the cost of that ongoing litigation certainly be less than what the settlement is. But Jim, any thoughts on best practices for our clients or plan sponsor fiduciaries?
Yeah, I think just as a best practice, ensuring that your plan document is up to date and highlights all the areas that forfeitures can be used. So, to the point Chris made, making sure your plan document reflects that forfeitures can be used to offset future employer contributions. They can be used to pay plan expenses, or they can be distributed back to participants in a uniform fashion. Making sure that all three of those are outlined in your plan document to give you the ultimate flexibility with how you want to use your forfeitures is important. And if you're not sure if your plan document's up to date, we want to make sure that we're doing operational audits to review your provisions and, make sure that, both your provisions around forfeitures and everything else is up to speed with how you're operating your plan from an administrative perspective. So again, the key thing is just making sure plan documents align with how you're operating as a business across the board. So that would be my key take.
Jim, Chris, great insights today. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on these important topics pertaining to the fiduciary oversight of retirement programs. Certainly looking forward to hearing more next quarter. Thanks.
Mike.
Thanks, everyone.